Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tigrai Press. Today, we have a special guest joining us, former U.S. Ambassador David Shinn, who has been with the State Department for 37 years. We are thrilled to have him here to discuss the upcoming U.S. presidential election, the situation in the Horn of Africa, particularly Tigray, Ethiopia, Somalia, Somaliland, Djibouti, and Sudan. Ambassador Shinn, welcome back and happy to see you here. Let us begin with the upcoming presidential election, which promises to be one of the most consequential in recent history. With former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris as the major nominees, how do you see the political landscape shaping up?
Good to see you, Bisrat. Well, I've been following these issues very closely, even while traveling in Europe. I've tried to stay attuned to what was going on in the political domain in the United States. The attempted assassination of former President Trump was most unfortunate. These kinds of things should not happen in the United States. Unfortunately, they happen more often than we would like. Not only have we had the assassination of President Kennedy and presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, and the attempted assassination of former President Ronald Reagan. There's far too much of a history of this kind of thing, and it absolutely has to come to an end. It reflects very poorly on American society when this happens. So everyone condemns this sort of activity. On the issues of the upcoming election, I think the standing down by President Biden was the right thing to do. I think many of us had concerns about his age. I'm several years older than Biden, and I know the impact that age takes on a person. And if you project forward 4 more years from age 81, or 82 actually, by the time he would take office if he were reelected, that really is an expectation of too much, I think, from any human being. It may be one thing to be a president of Cameroon in the late 80s, but to be president of the United States and in the mid to late 80s is just more than the human body, I think, can withstand. So I think that was a wise decision. It also has obviously energized the Democratic Party, which was in sort of the doldrums. The polls were not showing well, and it has revived, I think, the instincts of the party, and much support is being demonstrated for Kamala Harris. If you look at it from the standpoint of the impact on Africa, which is the way I tend to look at things, you have, I think, a very stark choice between a possible President Trump or a possible President Harris. Former President Trump never demonstrated any interest in Africa during his first 4 years in office. Basically, he let the bureaucracy run the Africa portfolio, and that maybe was a good thing because the bureaucracy tends to run on autopilot to some extent, and things don't change that much. And he did not get much involved in Africa policy. I see no reason that he would take much interest in Africa were he to be elected to another 4 years. On the other hand, you have Vice President Harris, who not only is of African American heritage in that her father is from Jamaica and is in all probability the progeny of enslaved Africans in Jamaica. Most indigenous people that came from Africa to Jamaica were former slaves, and her mother is from India, also a person of color. Well, she clearly is a person of color with a very mixed background and strong links ethnically to Africa. She visited Africa in 2023, having gone to Ghana, Zambia, and Tanzania. I don't think she professes to be an expert on African issues, but she does have an interest in the continent and is knowledgeable about it. If you look at the, taking first the probable Harris agenda towards Africa, I think you could project that it will be more or less an extension of the Biden agenda, with, I think, greater interest in the continent, greater personal engagement in it at the top level should Harris win than occurred with Biden, who did not visit the continent as promised. And that was one of Biden's failings, that he said he would visit, but then did not. I think you can be assured that a future President Harris would visit Africa. I don't think there would be any guarantee that a future President Trump would visit Africa. But the more important issues are the policy issues. I think we have a pretty good idea of what both a Trump administration and a Harris administration would do vis-a-vis Africa. As I say, in the case of Harris, it would be more or less what Biden has done, but giving it more attention. In the case of Trump, I think it would be a return to the 4 years that we saw under the Trump administration, and particularly what we see in Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation 900-page document dealing with every conceivable issue in the United States, including the State Department, USAID, and foreign policy. And interestingly, the 2 chapters on the State Department and USAID were drafted by former members of the Trump administration. One was a deputy administrator of USAID. The other was a woman who served as director of policy planning in the State Department for 1 year. So even though former President Trump likes to say that he does not know what Project 2025 is, he has nothing to do with it, that is utter rubbish. He knows very well what Project 2025 is all about, and it's largely his former staff members who wrote it. So I think it's safe to assume that much of what is in that report would be part of the agenda of the Trump administration. If I could just quote one sentence out of the State Department section that especially troubled me. This is the chapter that's written by Kieron K. Skinner, who spent 1 year as director of policy planning in the State Department. As far as I know, that's her only experience in the State Department. By contrast, I spent 37 years in the State Department from the bottom to the top. And I feel I have a little better understanding of how the State Department works than she does. Her report says, and this is in the introductory section, the most important part of it, is a major source, if not the main source, of the State Department's ineffectiveness lies in its institutional belief that it is an independent institution that knows what is best for the United States, sets its own foreign policy, and does not need direction from an elected president. This is absolute nonsense. The State Department is led by a Secretary of State appointed by the president, in this case, either a President Trump or a President Harris. All of the senior officials are political appointees who give direction to the career Foreign Service and career Civil Service officers in the State Department. And if those officers don't follow policy, they do one of 2 things. They either resign or they're fired. It's just that simple. Do they have independent points of view? Do they offer their best advice? Of course they do. But they ultimately follow the direction from the Secretary of State and the President. So this business about being a rogue organization off doing its own thing is about as far from the truth as you can possibly get. I urge all of your followers to to take a look at least parts of Project 2025. The whole focus of the document is to politicize all of the government agencies, including the State Department and USAID, so that they are nothing more than handmaidens for the president, and simply carry out his directives and nothing else, and do not offer any independent opinions. But it's an extraordinary document. It's 900 pages long. I've not read it all. I have no intention of reading all of it. I couldn't possibly wade through 900 pages of some of this gibberish. Anyway, rather strong comments on Project 2025. I would say that the section on sub-Saharan Africa in the State Department chapter is not bad. I suspect it was written by someone like Tibor Nagy, who is very knowledgeable about Africa and knowledgeable about the operations of the State Department. The only problem with it is that it relies very heavily upon the U.S. private sector taking responsibility for much of our engagement in Africa. And that's all well and good, and I favor that too. But the problem is no administration has been able to sufficiently incentivize the U.S. private sector to get that engaged in taking responsibility for foreign direct investment and trade and engagement on the continent. So it's a nice thought, but it's not going to be the solution to the problem. But otherwise, that chapter on sub-Saharan Africa is not a bad piece of work. So those are my 10 cents worth on Project 2025.
Thank you very much. Let me show what's the connection between the Vice President Kamala Harris and Africa. Very good, Ambassador David Shinn. If I can play also Reagan's last comment about immigrants,
that I will give as president, I think it's fitting to leave one final thought, an observation about a country which I love. It was stated best in a letter I received not long ago. A man wrote me and said, "You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." Yes, the torch of Lady Liberty symbolizes our freedom and represents our heritage, the compact with our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. It is that lady who gives us our great and special place in the world. For it's the great life force of each generation of new Americans that guarantees that America's triumph shall continue unsurpassed into the next century and beyond. Other countries may seek to compete with us, but in one vital area, as a beacon of freedom and opportunity that draws the people of the world, no country on earth comes close. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever closed the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost. A number of years ago, an American student traveling in Europe took an East German ship across the Baltic Sea. One of the ship's crew members from East Germany, a man in his 60s, struck up a conversation with the American student. After a while, the student asked the man how he had learned such good English, and the man explained that he had once lived in America. He said that for over a year he'd worked as a farmer in Oklahoma and California, that he'd planted tomatoes and picked ripe melons. It was, the man said, the happiest time of his life. Well, the student, who'd seen the awful conditions behind the Iron Curtain, blurted out the question, "Well, why did you ever leave?" "I had to," he said. "The war ended." The man had been in America as a German prisoner of war. Now, I don't tell this story to make the case for former POWs. Instead, I tell this story just to remind you of the magical, intoxicating power of America. We may sometimes forget it, but others do not. Even a man from a country at war with the United States, while held here as a prisoner, could fall in love with us. Those who become American citizens love this country even more, and that's why the Statue of Liberty lifts her lamp to welcome them to the Golden Door. It is bold men and women yearning for freedom and opportunity who leave their homelands and come to a new country to start their lives over. They believe in the American dream, and over they make it come true for themselves, for their children, and for others. They give more than they receive, they labor and succeed, and often they are entrepreneurs.
Incredible comment. If you want to comment on that, and then I will have another question.
I want to comment on that because I'm really pleased you ran that segment. I can remember those comments from before, and they're powerful, and they're from a true American conservative, not a phony conservative like we see so many of today, but a true conservative. And I think they're heartfelt, and they make such an important point that everyone living in this country today is an immigrant or is derived from an immigrant, except Native Americans who were here before all of the immigrants arrived. And if there's anyone who has any right to complain about immigrants coming to America, it's only Native Americans. No one else has that right. My father's family came from England as Quakers in the late 1600s. So that side of the family has been here a long time. My mother's family came much later in the late 1800s from Ireland. So they're relatively more recent, but we're all immigrants. And we need to accept each other as human beings, not to defile them, as unfortunately some people are doing in the United States today. So thank you for bringing Ronald Reagan's comments to the front here for people to see again. And as I say, this is from a conservative American Republican, one who appointed me as ambassador to Burkina Faso. But Bill Clinton appointed me as ambassador to Ethiopia, which again goes to the non-political side of how the Foreign Service works, which the Trump administration is trying to turn on its head.
Let's assume Trump wins the election and he intends to do the Agenda 2025. How would the Congress and Senate and the American people deal with that Agenda 2025?
Well, that's a great question. And of course, an enormous amount would depend upon the fabric of Congress after the elections are over. If, for example, the Republicans won a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate, and they've already captured the Supreme Court, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted to do. And then the limits would only be their own imaginations as to how they might implement that policy. And quite frankly, I would be very fearful how that would come out. I would not see a good end to that, particularly if they had relatively sizable majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The other possibility is that Trump could win the presidency, but lose in the House and or the Senate, and there would be a Democratic majority in one or both of those houses. If that were to happen, that would serve as a dramatic check on anything that he might try to do. There are certain things he can do by executive action, by executive order, but there are very strict limits to that. And if he doesn't have the House of Representatives and the Senate supporting him, then he's going to be quite limited in what he would be able to do.
Great. We'll move to the Horn of Africa. How do you characterize the Horn of Africa crisis and the U.S. policy of stability in the region? What went wrong, and how is the U.S. trying to address this crisis?
Well, one of the problems that the U.S. faces is that there is frequently an assumption, both in Africa and around the world sometimes, that the U.S. is going to solve everyone's problem. And unfortunately, we know that's not always possible. And in some cases, the U.S. is not willing to do it. In some cases, it can't do it. It just does not have the resources to do it. I would argue that in the case of the Horn of Africa, it has made a fairly significant effort to solve some of the issues, particularly in Ethiopia with the war in Tigray, especially, but also even today with the ongoing problems involving Amhara and Oromo and the ethnic difficulties there. I think behind the scenes, there's probably more discussion going on than we're aware of in the public domain. And the U.S. is engaged on those issues. It does have a special envoy dealing with those problems, in addition to the embassy in Addis Ababa. I would be critical of the United States for its inability to deal more successfully with Sudan and the conflict there, which is at the moment the worst conflict in the region. And it has not up to now been able to really step in and take the kinds of steps that are necessary to at least get the fighting stopped. Now, there is a new initiative recently underway to start a conference in Switzerland, which is co-chaired by the United States and Saudi Arabia. This is sort of a follow-on to the earlier Jeddah talks, which went nowhere. Remains to be seen how successful this is going to be. In fact, I'm not even certain that the Sudan Armed Forces has yet agreed to participate in the talks in Switzerland. I did see a news report that the Rapid Support Forces said they would participate. But at least it's an effort by the new special envoy for Sudan, the American special envoy for Sudan, and the government of the United States to engage in a meaningful way to bring the Sudan crisis to some sort of a better conclusion, because that problem is totally out of hand now, and it has the prospect for impacting the entire Horn of Africa in a negative way. So we'll see whether this works out or not. The remaining parts of the Horn at the moment are relatively quiet for the moment. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to remain quiet. They probably won't. But they're a little quieter than they have been as compared to earlier this summer. And as a result, I don't see that much reporting going on as to who is doing what to try to resolve the issues. In the final analysis, however, it's up to the governments themselves in the region to sort these issues out. The United States can try to step in. It can offer incentives. It can sanction groups or people. So far, these have not had much impact. They did have some impact on ending the war in Tigray, but otherwise they have not had much impact. And we all know the problems are all still there. They have not gone away. And even though they may be a little quieter at the moment, we're probably going to see a resumption of some of these issues in the coming weeks and months.
a few weeks ago, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has visited Sudan, particularly Port Sudan. Do you know the reason of his visit?
No, I mean, obviously I had no sort of access to anything that was said between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the government of Sudan. I can guess at some of the issues that were discussed. One would be the Sudanese refugees coming into Ethiopia. Those numbers are slowly growing. They're not huge at the moment. Most of the Sudanese refugees have gone into Chad or Egypt or Central African Republic, but growing numbers are coming into Ethiopia. That would be an issue. The Sudan-Ethiopian border in the Fashaga area was almost certainly under discussion. That's been a contentious issue for many years. It became a lightning rod of a problem during the war with Tigray. It's still unresolved, and both Sudan and Ethiopia have their mutual claims on that section of that part of what is now being farmed by Ethiopians. And I have no doubt but what that was raised. What was said, I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. And I also assume that there was some discussion about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and Sudan's position on it. Sudan was a year or two ago aligning itself with Egypt on the future of the dam and the allocation of water. It seems to have backed away from that to some extent in the last year or two. And it's, in any event, it's totally preoccupied with the conflict in Sudan. So it really doesn't have much time to think about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. But if I were Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, I would certainly use the occasion to raise the topic, and I'm almost certain it was raised. So I think from Ethiopia's point of view, those were probably the three primary issues that came up. From the Sudanese point of view, the head of the armed forces there would like to see support from Ethiopia, or at least no support for the rapid support forces in Sudan. And I have no doubt but what he asked for that. But what the response was, again, I don't know.
Okay. Ethiopia's relationship with Somalia has declined after the MoU between Abiy and Somali's president Hassan Sheikh. Given the United States recognize Somalia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, what actions is the U.S. taking to address the crisis, especially with Al-Shabaab's revival?
I can only speculate what the U.S. is doing, since I don't know what the conversations have been between the governments. But I'm sure that I'm relatively sure, based on how the U.S. normally reacts to these kinds of things, that it's urging a lot of caution to both Somalia and Ethiopia and Somaliland not to let this get out of hand, and is probably urging Ethiopia to go slowly on any significant change that it makes in the way it deals with Somaliland. The relationship with Somalia has already broken down. That's a negative development that makes life easier for Al-Shabaab, and that is of concern to the United States. The United States and Somalia and Ethiopia want to see the defeat of Al-Shabaab. There's agreement on that. But now there's not agreement on how you go about achieving that goal. And the Ethiopia-Somaliland MoU has complicated that discussion. And I have not seen any kind of future resolution to the problem on behalf of either Somaliland or Ethiopia. I do find it interesting that we're not hearing much about the MoU. There may be private discussions going on that are making progress on the MoU. But it's interesting to me that there has still been no public announcement of a recognition of Somaliland and There has been no indication about the establishment of any kind of a military base, Ethiopian military base in Somaliland. So things are clearly moving slowly, if they're moving at all. And it may be that things have crawled or have gotten down to a snail's pace when it comes to progress on this issue. But it certainly has roiled the political alignments in the Horn of Africa.
How have neighboring states such as Somalia, Djibouti, reacted to the MoU between Ethiopia and Somaliland?
I'm not aware that any neighboring state has come out in favor of it. They've either been negative on it, or they have not said much of anything on the MoU. And in recent months, I haven't seen any comment, period, by neighboring states on the issue. They too seem to want to put it aside and probably hope that it just goes away. But I don't see any significant support for the MoU from neighboring states.
Mm-hmm. How might this MoU impact Djibouti, particularly considering its strategic ports and trade routes?
Well, if the MoU were to be implemented, it could have a significant impact upon Djibouti. It could result in additional commerce, imports and exports, going through Berbera and eventually into Ethiopia, reducing the amount that goes through Djibouti today. It could reduce the importance of Djibouti for Ethiopia. That would be important. It obviously would enhance the role of Somaliland in the region. And this, if the MoU were implemented, that presumably means that Ethiopia also recognizes Somaliland as an independent country. That may open the door for others to recognize. I suspect it would, and that there would be some African countries that would follow suit on that. So it would have if implemented, it would have a pretty dramatic impact on Somaliland and Djibouti, more on Somaliland than Djibouti. I think a lot of the commerce is going to continue to go through Djibouti no matter what, because that's where the railroad goes. There's no railroad between Berbera and Ethiopia, and that's where the probably the better road structure is, although I'm told that the road structure between Berbera and Ethiopia today is really quite good, and much better than during my time there.
What is the current U.S. policy towards Somaliland, and how has it evolved over time?
Well, that's an interesting question. In terms of the Biden administration, and probably in terms of a potential Harris administration, I don't think there would be any change. In other words, the United States would continue to follow the guidelines of the African Union, and until the African Union decided to recognize Somaliland, the United States would not take any action. In other words, the policy would remain the same. And I don't see any likelihood in the foreseeable future that the African Union intends to change its point of view. What's interesting, however, is that in Project 2025 that I was talking about at the outset, there's a specific reference to the recognition of Somaliland. Should Donald Trump win the presidency? Now, whether that would in fact happen, not necessarily. This is the Heritage Foundation's document. Technically, it's not Donald Trump's document, so he could ignore that if he wished. But it's very interesting that the people around Donald Trump from his first administration have stated in writing that they would welcome the recognition of Somaliland.
What strategic interests does the United States have in Somaliland, particularly in terms of security and counterterrorism?
Well, so long as the United States has its facility in Djibouti, I don't think there's any serious thought about doing anything in Somaliland. If there were a problem at some point in the future where the United States were asked to leave Djibouti, then it would be looking around for somewhere else to have a military facility, and Somaliland could conceivably be one of those locations, or it could be somewhere else in the region. It wouldn't necessarily be Somaliland. But first, there's no indication that the United States is going to be pushed out of Djibouti, so it may be a moot point. In terms of other strategic interests in Somaliland or in that immediate area, the primary concern is to ensure that extremism does not take hold there. In Somaliland, Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, it's to keep the extremists, whatever their stripe is, whatever their title is, out. And that includes, of course, Al-Shabaab. But those are the primary strategic interests. There are no oil or mineral interests of any great note that I'm aware of. There's gas in Ethiopia, but there may be some oil in the region, but these are not of great interest to the United States.
What economic opportunities might the United States be pursuing in Somaliland, especially in sectors like trade and investment?
Somaliland is a very small country. It does not loom large in American trade and probably never will. I don't see that the United States looks at Somaliland as a significant location for trade and investment. It would be nice if there could be foreign direct investment there, even under the current circumstances where it does not have legal independence yet or recognized independence from the international community. I think American investors ought to look at Somaliland, but it's so small and the market is so tiny that it's just never going to loom large in the American private sector.
Mm-hmm. How is the United States engaging diplomatically with both Somaliland and Ethiopia regarding their new MoU?
Again, I can only guess at what's going on. Certainly, they're engaging with the Ethiopian government on it because we do have not only a full embassy in Addis Ababa, but we have a special envoy for dealing with Ethiopia, and that has to be one of the major agenda items. And I can't add anything to what I said earlier in that the United States is urging, I'm sure, caution in how Ethiopia pursues this. I don't know the extent to which they are engaging with the government of Somaliland on the issue, or even who is doing that. I don't know whether it's Mike Hammer, who is the special envoy, or whether it would be our embassy in Mogadishu that might make occasional trips to Hargeisa. But frankly, I just don't know if that's happening.
How might the MoU between Ethiopia and Somaliland affect the U.S. presence and influence in the region?
So long as something can be worked out that does not disrupt the entire Horn of Africa, it probably would not have a huge impact upon American engagement in the region. And I think that's the hope of the United States, that whatever happens with that MoU, whether it's implemented, partially implemented, not implemented at all, that it not throw into chaos the wider region. Because if that were to happen, that would impact negatively American interests in the region also. So that would be, I think, the primary American goal.
IGAD has become highly divided and weak over the past 6 years. What caused this decline, and what can be done to strengthen it?
Well, that's very simple. The members of IGAD are the disputants in the region themselves, and until such time as they are no longer disputants, IGAD is going to be a weak and not very effective organization. It can't be. So in the first instance, all of these countries in the Horn of Africa have to get along and love each other. And once they do that, IGAD will be a very strong and important organization. And until that happens, it's not going to be.
Recent history shows diminishing security in the Horn of Africa. What does research indicate about the origins of this crisis?
Which crisis are you referring to here?
Security as a whole. Al-Shabaab is there. Other elements are there. So security has been diminishing in the Horn of Africa, during the recent years. So what does research indicate about the origins of this crisis?
No, I see what you're driving at here. And I would argue that now you have to get back to the root causes of why you have this extremism developing in places like Somalia, where Al-Shabaab has been such a problem, and where other organizations, the Islamic State, for example, has also been involved to a lesser extent in Somalia. And earlier on, you had extremism in Sudan. Until you can deal with the root causes, and that is political inequality, economic inequality, improving economic development generally, improving the life for ordinary Africans living in all of these countries, you're not going to eliminate extremism. There's going to be a fundamental reason for some group to try to exploit extremism to its own advantage. And this is a long, hard battle to eliminate these very serious problems that exist worldwide. These are not unique to the Horn of Africa, but they tend to be more innate and perhaps more serious in some of the Horn of African countries than they are in certain other parts of the world. But I've looked at the issue of conflict in the Horn of Africa for many decades, and I've always argued that if you don't deal with the root causes, you're not going to solve it. You can paste over it, you can beat it down temporarily, and then it's going to raise its ugly head again at some point in time or in a different location in the region. So the whole focus has, and another big issue is corruption. You have got to get rid of corruption, or at least make corruption much less of an issue than it is in almost all of these countries.
The improved relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea was praised until Abiy received the Nobel Peace Prize. Now relations have deteriorated. Was the initial improvement primarily to address a common Ethiopian quote enemy unquote, and was Nobel Prize premature?
Certainly, with the benefit of hindsight, one could argue that the Peace Prize was premature. At the time it was given for a good reason. The ending of the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea was a very positive development, and we were all enthusiastic about the potential results of that over the long term, thinking this might portend a much better future, not only for Ethiopia-Eritrea relations, but for the Horn of Africa generally. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass. And if anything, things got worse. So with hindsight, sure, one can argue that that it was premature.
Ethio-Djibouti and Ethio-Sudan relations are strained, but haven't completely broken down. Is the United States closely monitoring this, and is there hope for improvement?
I don't know how closely they're monitoring specifically Ethiopia-Djibouti relations or Ethiopia-Sudan relations. They're certainly following this as part of the wider issue of political stability and security throughout the Horn of Africa. And these two relationships are linked to that. So it will be part of the consideration in both in Washington and in our embassies in the field The degree to which they're getting down to these specific relationships, I'm not in a position to know any longer. But I assume they consider these to be important relationships and that they are paying pretty close attention to them.
The war in Tigray ended with the cessation of hostilities agreement in November 2022. However, many IDPs and refugees have not returned home, and Tigray's constitutional order is not restored. Despite signing an agreement, the Ethiopian government hasn't recognized the TPLF as a legal political organization, considering TPLF's stake on the agreement. Why haven't mediators and observers pressed Ethiopia to comply? How do you evaluate Abiy's recent threat of war against the TPLF and the people of Tigray? Why are the African Union and United States silent as tensions rise, and are they internally supporting the Addis government?
Well, again, we never know what is going on confidentially in government discussions involving countries outside of the Horn of Africa or those concerning the governments of the Horn of Africa. There may be more effort behind the scenes to encourage Ethiopia and other countries to comply with this agreement than we're aware of. And I would hope that would be the case, but I don't know that that's the case. But it's very difficult for outsiders to be in a position to know what is being said among the insiders, because we're not inside. I'm not an insider any longer, and I don't know. It may be that not enough is being done. That's a very real possibility. On the other hand, there may be a lot being done that we're just not aware of. So I'm really reluctant to go beyond that, because it's an area where I just don't feel I have sufficient knowledge on what's going on.
Can we conclude that the United States policy in the Horn of Africa has failed in the past 6 years, given the situation in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia? If so, why isn't the United States reflecting on and correcting its policy?
Well, it certainly has not been a roaring success. On the other hand, I think if you look at the Pretoria Agreement that ended the war between Tigray and the federal government, that has to be seen as a success, not necessarily for the United States, but certainly the United States was involved in that and played a role in it. If you want to make it an African success, that's fine. No one should insist upon being the author of success as long as there is a success. And at least it got the fighting stopped, and the fighting has fortunately not resumed. So that's a big plus. The situation in Sudan is totally out of hand, and nobody can claim any success in that mess at the moment. And some of the other ethnic issues in Ethiopia seem to be totally unresolved. You don't have at least Eritrea and Ethiopia fighting at the moment. That's a sort of a modest, limited success. And the situation with Ethiopia and Somalia, although very competitive and not a good relationship at all, at least it's not a hot war. So things could be worse, believe it or not. And one has to sometimes accept little victories, and that may simply mean that things are not any worse than they already are. So it's a mixed bag, but I would certainly not say that either U.S. efforts or international efforts or African Union efforts in the region have been successful in the last 6 years. They have largely not been successful, with a couple of exceptions here and there.
What are the potential future scenarios for Tigray, and what steps are needed for a sustainable resolution?
maybe if I knew the answer to those questions, I'd be occupying an important position in the U.S. government, and I'm not there. So that's an indication they don't think I have the answers. You certainly need to have acceptance from all parties of a desire to create a state which works for the benefit of the people in all of these countries in the Horn. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that is the situation throughout the Horn of Africa today. It certainly is not the situation in Sudan, where the parties are doing just the opposite. They're working against the interests of the Sudanese people, and the Sudanese people are dying as a result. It's a little less clear in a place like Ethiopia or Somalia or Djibouti or even Eritrea, for that matter, whether the governments are working primarily in the interests of the people or whether they're working primarily to maintain themselves in power. And I worry sometimes that it all too often is to maintain oneself in power. And I just wish that governance generally in the region would devote more of its effort to looking at what has to be done to make life better for the people, even if it means doing the unexpected. Like in the United States, the case of President Biden standing down for election. It doesn't happen very often in Africa. Occasionally it does, but I certainly haven't seen that kind of self-sacrifice in the Horn of Africa recently.
How do you think the Ethiopian government is addressing the severe famine in Tigray and the overall social, economic, and political challenges in Tigray and the broader Horn of Africa? What measures are being taken to resolve these issues?
Although I don't have details upon what the government is doing, I certainly have the impression that accessibility has improved enormously in places where emergency supplies have to move. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe there are areas that are still being cut off by governments, either the Ethiopian government or some other government. And if so, I stand corrected. But certainly the situation, I think, is better than it was a year or two ago. This happens to be one area that I give the American government great credit for. It has always been the first with the most humanitarian assistance throughout all of the Horn of Africa. In the horrible situation in Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia and Eritrea, always the first with the most. And sometimes I think we don't get adequate credit for that. And we've always insisted on accessibility for the delivery of this assistance. We haven't always achieved that. In fact, sometimes we failed miserably at it, but we've always insisted upon it. And it often has made a difference. So it's hard for me to know exactly on the ground what is going on with the government of Ethiopia, for example, whether there still are areas that are off limits or not, but the situation clearly is getting better.
The New Lines of Institute recently released a comprehensive report concluding the Ethiopian forces committed acts constituting genocide during the Tigray conflict from 2020 to 2022. The report details that the Ethiopian National Defense Force, alongside allied Eritrean forces and regional militias, engaged in deliberate mass killings, starvation tactics, and inflicted life-threatening conditions aimed at destroying the Tigrayan ethnic group. It also highlights the use of social media to incite genocide. The report supports its findings with the multiple credible independent sources and calls for Ethiopia to be held accountable before the International Court of Justice. It emphasizes the need for the international community to exert pressure on Ethiopia through diplomatic channels to address this severe violation of human rights and international law. Why haven't the United States Congress, Senate, and executive branch elaborated on the recommendations initiated by new lines of institution regarding their implementation?
Well, one, I don't know why they have not taken action on it, other than the fact that they may be so preoccupied with issues globally, such as the war in Ukraine, the war between Israel and Gaza, and a half a dozen other issues that are impacting the time and energy of members of Congress or the executive branch, for that matter. This whole issue of accountability is critical. It does have to be dealt with, and it's one of the hardest issues in the world to deal with on the international level. Whether we're talking about Ethiopia or whether we're talking about Bosnia or South Africa or whatever, it doesn't matter what country it is. These are always really hard issues. Rwanda is another classic example where they sort of dealt with it in their own way through their Gachaga process, which was sort of an interesting, unique approach to it. Probably what has to be done is to look at some of the best examples of accountability, dealing with accountability. South Africa might be one of the better ones, to see if there isn't something that can be borrowed there for, in the case of Ethiopia. But it's always a hard, long, drawn-out process. It is almost never satisfactorily resolved, but that doesn't mean you can ignore it, because if you ignore it, it will tend to happen again at some point in the future. I wish I had a better answer for this, but I do know how hard it is to proceed with accountability, and it's important that international organizations particularly continue to impress upon Ethiopia and other countries in the region that are culpable. Sudan, goodness knows, the factions in Sudan are culpable, perhaps even more so than in Ethiopia. And they too have to be brought to account at some point. I don't have a real good answer to the problem, except that it needs to be pursued.
What actions can the Tigray interim administration, the Tigray diaspora, and the international community take to ensure the successful implementation of these recommendations by the United Nations Security Council?
Other than putting pressure on the council to do something about it, I don't know what they can do, quite frankly. It seems like their hands are pretty much tied, as so many other groups who have experienced this kind of a problem have experienced in other parts of the world. And they too have had the same kinds of difficulties. I'm not sure there's a good answer to the question. You simply use the leverage you have to put pressure on those points, UN Security Council or whatever, to follow up with further action. And you do the best you can, which rarely is good enough.
Ambassador David Shinn, as always, thank you very much for your presence today. And we also thank you for your reflection on Horn of Africa, US election, Ethiopia, Tigray, and the entire region. And we hope to see you again in the near future.
Happy to join you, Bisrat. Sorry I don't have all the answers, but I've never had all the answers and never will. All I can do is give you my best judgment.
The most important thing is your reflection, your experience.
Very good. Well, I wish you all the best too.